Chapter 4, Information Security Policy. The learning outcomes include define InfoSec policy and its central role in a successful InfoSec program, describe the three major types of InfoSec policy and the major components of each, explain how to implement effective policy, and discuss how to develop, implement, and maintain InfoSec policies. We will cover these learning outcomes in the following 4 sections. We start with Section 1, Why Policy? This section will cover the first learning outcome, define InfoSec policy and its central role in a successful InfoSec program. Policy is the essential foundation of an effective InfoSec program. The success of protecting information assets depends on the policy generated and on the attitude of management toward information security. You, the policymaker, set the tone and the emphasis on securing information assets and how important a role information security will have within your agency. Your primary responsibility is to set the information resource security policy for the organization with the objectives of reduced risk, compliance with laws and regulations, and assurance of operational continuity, information integrity, and confidentiality. Why do we use policies? A quality information security program begins and ends with policy. You cannot secure the information assets without clearly outlined and enforced policy mechanisms. Policies are the least expensive means of control, which makes them very attractive to organizations. However, policies are often the most difficult to implement. A clear and well-written policy increases the chances of successful security for the organization's information assets. Some basic guidelines to follow when shaping policies include the following. Policy should never conflict with law. If it does, law will always supersede the written policy, and the policy will be unenforceable. Policy must stand up in court if challenged. See the previous point. And privacy policy must be properly supported and administered. Here, C-level executives must understand the importance of security and provide the resources needed to maintain, update, and implement InfoSec programs. Bergeron and Berube provide additional advice on developing information security guidelines. All policies must contribute to the success of the organization. Management must ensure the adequate sharing of responsibility for proper use of information systems. End users of information systems should be involved in the steps of policy formulation. If you want them to buy in and use the system, you better get them involved early. Policies are important reference documents for internal audits and for the resolution of legal disputes about management's due diligence. Policy documents can act as clear statements of management's intent. Policies are authorized and supported by C-level management based on regulations and organizational culture. Standards are detailed minimum specifications for compliance with the InfoSec policies developed and are created after the policies. Several guidelines provide recommendations for how an organization can comply with the policies and standards. Procedures are detailed step-by-step instructions that explain how to comply with InfoSec guidelines. These procedures are developed at business unit levels and in line with the policies, standards, and guidelines already implemented. Before we go further, let's clarify some definitions and provide a few examples. We start with policy. An example includes all employees must have strong passwords that are changed routinely. While that policy doesn't define strong, it's clear, straightforward, and easy to implement. Next is policy plus standard. If we think back to the policy requiring everyone to have a password to sign in, a policy plus standard provides clarification and specification. For instance, all employees must have strong passwords consisting of at least 10 characters, including at least one uppercase and one lowercase letter, one number, and one special character. Passwords should be changed routinely, at least every 180 days, without allowing reuse. If you're like me, the standards make it hard for me to remember all of my passwords across multiple networks with different guidelines on how to create passwords and different time frames for changing passwords. That's why I use LastPass to manage all of my passwords. There are many other password management tools that you may choose to use. Guidelines provide additional guidance to users who need access to organizational assets. For example, refer to Section 3.3 of the Employee Handbook for recommendations in selecting strong passwords that employees can remember, or for selecting approved password support applications for your mobile device. Refer to abc.com/passwords. Procedures describe how you may correctly follow InfoSec policies. For example, to change your password, log in using your current password, then select Dashboard and Change Password. References to other policies may be relevant to the task that you're trying to complete. For instance, refer to the Employee Handbook on system use for additional restrictions. Practices may outline industry best practices, including relevant rules and regulations under which you operate. For instance, HIPAA requires that organizations which maintain healthcare-related, personally identifiable information must have an incident response plan. Thus, a written practice may state, create and maintain a current incident response plan in consultation with end users and review at least every 3 months. For policies to be effective, they must be properly disseminated. If you don't distribute them to all stakeholders, like on a website, then the problem won't even be known, much less enforced. Read. While you can't make someone read a policy, you can make them scroll down and click on I agree to indicate that they read and agree to the following policy. A reasonable person, which is a legal word with specific meaning, would read a document before signing, and we all should do that. We are agreeing to certain restrictions and limiting our options. So will you read before you click on I agree now? I promise to skim the documents and will try to read. Policies must further be understood. The language should be written at a level that all types of end users will be able to understand, if they choose to read the policy, of course. Agreed to. This is where we have the I agree option. Many healthcare-related policies use a paper document with an in-person signature to try to limit their liability. And uniformly enforced. Policies consistently enforced across all divisions, units, and employee levels. The policies apply to everybody in the organization. While these guidelines help create effective policies, you must commit to reviewing and modifying policies on a regular basis, to remain current with regulations, to update based on end user feedback, etc. In order to produce a complete information security policy, management must define 3 types of information security policy. First is Enterprise Information Security Program Policy, which is relevant to everyone who accesses information assets throughout the organization. An example would be requiring a password to access networks. Second is issue-specific information security policies, which handle specific known problems or areas of concern, such as a policy on downloading sensitive data. Third is system-specific policies. For instance, an employee who has direct write capability on a patient's active healthcare data may have two-factor authentication to ensure that access to the system is limited to only those who have appropriate credentials. To summarize, development of successful information security policies requires a deep understanding of the organization, its users, and any relevant laws, regulations, and industry best practices. Understanding how to develop policy that will be used throughout the organization is necessary for successful InfoSec policy implementation. Information policies must be available to users, published online, reinforced in training, and understandable to all end users. The InfoSec planner must understand the different access levels and systems available to end users prior to development of InfoSec policy. You need to ensure clarity and consistency in policies when writing for the enterprise, for specific systems, and for relevant issues. We continue Chapter 4, Information Security Policy. This is Section 2, Types of Policies. In this section, we will cover the second learning outcome, describe the 3 major types of information security policy, and discuss the major components of each. Let's return to the 3 types of information security policies that we mentioned in the last section and look at each of them more closely. We will begin with Enterprise Information Security Policies. Enterprise Information Security Policy is created at a high level with a view of the enterprise as a whole. It sets the strategic direction, scope, and tone for all of an organization's information security efforts. Enterprise Information Security Policy is also known as Security Program Policy, General Security Policy, IT Security Policy, High-Level InfoSec Policy, InfoSec Policy, or whatever terminology is preferred by your organization. Now we turn to some of the elements of an effective enterprise information security policy. It's important that the organization states the purpose of the information security policies developed. The purpose answers the question why. It may identify the elements included in the enterprise InfoSec policy, explain the need for InfoSec policy planning, specify the various categories of information security, and delineate the roles and responsibilities for those who manage, implement, and update information security policies. The Enterprise InfoSec policy also describes the importance of information security within the organization, identifying the critical components of the plan. Within this section, your organization may describe the importance of protecting the information assets in a healthcare setting, where sensitive, personally identifiable information is collected and must be secured. The need for information security is clear in a healthcare organization to protect the sensitive, legally protected, personally identifiable information. Enterprise information security policy also must outline the structure of the information security team within the organization. Who does what and what are their major responsibilities? Finally, enterprise InfoSec policy elements may include references to legal, regulatory, and/or industry documents that are relevant to the protection of information assets within the organization. For instance, a healthcare organization may reference components of HIPAA and then provide a URL for more information. Or the enterprise InfoSec policy will even copy portions of HIPAA verbatim with reference to the original law, of course. An understanding of specific elements is important when developing enterprise information security policies. First, an overview of the corporate philosophy on security. How important is security given the context of the organization, its employees, and its stakeholders? Enterprise InfoSec policy elements include guidelines on the structure of the organization and individuals who fulfill the InfoSec role within the organization. Enterprise InfoSec policy must include the specific responsibilities for security that are shared by all stakeholders within the organization, to include doctors, nurses, legal teams, patient advocates, data analysts, patients, etc. Contracts, consultants, partners, and visitors should also be included. Finally, Enterprise InfoSec policy fully describes the responsibilities for security that are unique to each role within the organization. For instance, the security guard at the front desk has different responsibilities than the nurse, who has different responsibilities than the billing department, which has different responsibilities than the therapist. Taken together, these Enterprise InfoSec policy elements fully describe the organization's view on information security and highlight its importance within the context of the relevant rules, laws, regulations, and standards of the industry in which the organization operates. Clearly, within a healthcare setting, Enterprise InfoSec policy is vitally important and must be integrated throughout the organization. Now we move to issue-specific information security policies. An issue-specific security policy is an organizational policy that provides detailed, targeted guidance to instruct all members of the organization in the use of a resource, such as one of its processes or technologies. Using the Epic system to update patient information, for instance, might be an issue-specific policy. The issue-specific security policy should assure members of the organizations that its purpose is not to establish a foundation for administrative enforcement or legal prosecution, but rather to provide an understanding of the purposes an employee can and cannot use the resources for. You're not trying to catch someone doing something wrong, but rather hoping to prevent it in the first place. An effective issue-specific security policy accomplishes the following. It articulates expectations about how specific systems should be used. It documents how the system is controlled and who controls it. And it indemnifies the organization against liability for an employee's inappropriate or illegal use of the system. Every organization's issue-specific security policy should address specific technology-based systems, require frequent updates, and contain an issue statement on the organization's position on an issue. Issue-specific security policy should describe proper use and protection of company information assets. This could include issues such as email, instant messaging, and other communications apps, use of the internet, the web, and company networks, including personal and organizational network use. Are you allowed to complete personal tasks like checking Facebook on organization assets? What if you bring your own device? May you check Facebook on that device? Specific policies must address all approved and unapproved tasks. Malware protection specifications. What to do if you believe an information asset used for organizational business has been compromised, and how to protect the organization's information assets and technology. Non-organizationally issued software or hardware or organization assets. This is where a technology use policy is key. Is someone allowed to load a new app or other software on a system owned by the organization? Are they allowed to take home company-owned technology devices? What if personal equipment that is used for organizational related activities becomes compromised? Guidelines on how to protect personal assets that are used for organizational business should be clearly noted. If personally identifiable information is stored on non-organization-owned technology, you must specify how is it protected. What about organization information needs? How is access protected, and how may users request access to technologies which are needed to accomplish their responsibilities? Issue-specific security policies also state prohibitions against hacking or testing security controls or attempting to modify or escalate privileges. Someone can't try to guess your password or see if they can access information they are not entitled to view. Finally, organizational telecommunications technologies and networks. Who is allowed to use the organizational network and under what circumstances? Is any personal use of the organizational-owned equipment allowed, whether during or after work hours, and whether accessing with personally owned or organizationally owned equipment? How about the photocopier, the scanner, etc.? The policy should clearly outline these and other issue-specific topics. The elements of the issue-specific security policy should include the following. A statement of purpose. This is where the InfoSec scope is discussed, along with the applicability of the policy to specific instances. Technology included in the policy is specifically described, along with the responsibilities of those insured to protect information assets. The next element discussed is the authorized access and usage of equipment. In this element, user access and controls are discussed, along with the outlines of fair and responsible use of technology. As we discussed previously, things like the mix of personal and professional use of organizational assets should be addressed. Finally, the importance of protecting the privacy of the organization's information assets should be discussed here. The third element is the prohibited use of equipment. The user knows what he or she can use, but what can they not use? Certainly, use of technology for disruptive use or mischief, planting a virus or malware, for instance, would be prohibited. Specifically stating that criminal use of equipment is not allowed should be included in this section of the policy, along with prohibiting offensive attacks on the network, illegal or harassing email messages, voicemails, social media, and the like would also be excluded. It's appropriate to define what is meant by offensive at work, since that varies from group to group. when you're talking about offensive email messages. Next, the policy should specifically and clearly state that users are not allowed to violate intellectual property rights, including copyright, trademarks, trade secrets, patents, and click-wrap agreement. Any other restrictions of company-owned equipment should be included in this section as well. The issue-specific security policy should discuss systems management. Who is in charge of managing the shared information assets of the organization? Have they completed training? And how can they be good stewards of the information assets, protecting it from invalid access? Will employees be monitored? If so, in what ways and how and when? Will they only be monitored in certain locations or while completing certain activities? In my view, if you're going to monitor your employees, then tell them. The goal is not to catch someone violating policy, but to educate and train them so that they don't violate policy in the first place. The systems management element should specify how information assets are protected from viruses, malware, and related, using encryption or other industry standards, and how physical security of information assets is accomplished. You can have the best controls in the world, but if someone lets an unauthorized user into a protected location or shares their password with someone who should not have it, then the information assets are vulnerable. As mentioned previously, if at all possible, it is a good idea to combine physical and digital protection of information assets. Then there is coordination between the groups to protect privacy and information assets. Any information security policy should specify what happens and how the policy is violated, when it's violated, who is alerted, and what happens. All information security policies will need regular review and modification. The document should clearly announce the scheduled review of InfoSec policies. When are they reviewed? How are they reviewed? And who is involved in the review? Finally, the issue-specific security policy establishes some limitations of liability. The organization may clearly state limitations of liability and make disclaimers regarding liability. While the organization may make statements regarding liability, protections from liability may not be absolute. The organization does as much as it can to limit liability, but simply publishing the statement does not make it so. A court could decide otherwise. There are several different approaches to implementing the issue-specific system policies. Common approaches include creating a number of independent documents, creating a single comprehensive document, or using a modular document that brings together policy creation and administration. The recommended policy approach is the module policy, which provides a balance between issue orientation and policy management. Let's take a look at a legal case example that clarifies some of the information security policies and provides guidance on appropriate wording. Maria Stengart worked at Loving Care Agency, which provided care services for children and adults. In December 2007, Stengart wrote several emails to her lawyer from her personal password-protected email account using a company-owned laptop. Stengart was claiming gender discrimination and thus the need for the lawyers. After Stengart resigned, Loving Care hired a computer forensics expert and obtained the hard drive of the computer used by Stengart and all the email messages. Stengart's attorney, Donald Jacobs, asked for all emails to be returned and copies destroyed. He argued that there is a reasonable expectation of privacy in personal emails on company computers and that attorney-client communication protections should not be violated. The court, however, decided that the emails were not protected by client-attorney privilege because the company's policy indicated that the emails were part of the company's property. The appellate court, however, reversed the trial court decision and said there was improper respect for attorney-client privilege. Loving Care then appealed the decision to the New Jersey Supreme Court for the final ruling. The New Jersey Supreme Court evaluated all the evidence and decided that the attorney-client emails were privileged. There were several reasons why this case was decided in favor of the plaintiff. This is not a typical case. Most cases decide in the favor of the employer. Decisions in different states might be different. Look at Smith versus Pillsbury in Pennsylvania, for instance. In that case, Pillsbury said they would never view email messages. Even if they did, they said they would never fire someone for what was in email. Smith complained to a supervisor via email and was terminated. The court upheld Pillsbury's rights as owners of the email. Smith versus Pillsbury is a more traditional outcome. Courts rarely decide in favor of the employee when it comes to email at work. However, in the Stengart case, the employer privacy protections were higher for a couple of reasons. Attorney-client privilege is a separate and distinct right from personal privacy. It carries more weight than employer or employee privacy. The policy at Loving Care did not specifically say that email at work had no expectations of privacy. In fact, they didn't say whether email did or did not have expectations of privacy at all. The password for the personal email was not stored on the company server, so Stengart had taken extra efforts to protect the email messages. And there was a legend on the email messages stating that the messages were privileged and subject to attorney-client privilege. Again, this case is not typical. Most cases are decided in the employer's favor, and employees should expect no privacy rights at work. However, as InfoSec professionals, you can help your end users understand the clearly written policy so that there are few or no misunderstandings. I've included some of the references I used for this case, and feel free to check out a couple of them to read more about the case and the decision. I also included a link to the Wikipedia page that discusses Smith versus Pillsbury. There are several points that are important to note as InfoSec professionals. First, in the Stengart case, the court determined that Stengart had an expectation of privacy in emails with her lawyer. Thus, as information security professionals, we must seek to understand the legality of accessing and reading employee emails and understand that there may be limitations to our rights. However, the court also specifically stated that the decision, quote, does not mean that employers cannot monitor or regulate the use of workplace computers. Companies can adopt lawful policies related to computer use or to protect the assets, reputations, and productivity of a business and to ensure compliance with legitimate corporate policies. And employers can enforce such policies. They may discipline employees and, when appropriate, terminate them for violating proper workplace rules that are not inconsistent with a clear mandate of public policy. This decision reinforces how important it is for us to design InfoSec policies that are clear, understandable, consistently enforced, and not in violation of public policy, laws, rules, or regulations, or in this case, attorney-client privilege. Next, the court said, quote, because of the important public privacy concerns underlying the attorney-client privilege, even a more clearly written company manual, that is a policy that banned all personal computer use and provided unambiguous notice that an employee could retrieve and read an employer's attorney-client communications if accessed on a personal password-protected email account using the company's computer system, would not be enforceable. So we can't even write policy that would be sufficient to override the attorney-client privilege. Finally, the court said, quote, the defense counsel erred in deciding not to set aside the emails upon determination of their potential privilege and notify plaintiff's counsel of their possession of the emails before proceeding. Thus, there were several errors made by trial courts, as noted by the New Jersey Supreme Court. Using this case, we can develop better InfoSec policy rules in the organization. Now we look at system-specific information security policies. System-specific security policies have a slightly different look than the enterprise and issue-specific information security policies. In fact, they may seem more like a set of steps or procedures. System-specific policies do function as standards or procedures that are used when systems are configured and/or maintained. They are created by management to guide the implementation and configuration of the organization's technology assets. System-specific InfoSec policies apply to any technology that affects the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of information. So you have desktops at your organization? Check. Telephones? Check. Laptops, cell phones, iPads, Surface Pro? Check, check, and check. Cloud computing? Yep. Contracts dealing with technology? Yep, that applies too. These rules help to inform those who use, program, configure, and support the organization's technology to ensure that information and technology assets are used as intended. System-specific policies can be divided into managerial guidance, technical specifications, or combined into a single unified system-specific security policies document. Now we turn to technical specifications, which are directions for system administrators on how to implement managerial policy for the organization. What does the organization plan to do with the technology? Knowing that, how can we configure the system to meet those needs? Each type of technology has its own type of policy. Policies for portable devices, for instance, will be different than policies for desktops, cloud computing, cell phones, etc. There are two ways of implementing the technical controls: through access control lists, or ACLs, and through configuration rules. Access control list will include information for the system administrator who needs to know how to establish access levels, priorities, etc. They include user access lists, matrices, and capability tables that govern rights and privileges. A capability table specifies which subjects and objects that users or groups can access. For instance, doctors and nurses would have access to patient records for read, write, and possibly delete, but only for those patients who are under their care. They likely won't have access to the billing or financial information on the patient. They don't need it. and it would complicate their view. Similarly, accounts payable does not need to have access to day-to-day patient management. Once the patient recovers, accounts payable might need to have a list of procedures that were administered, drugs, anesthesia, etc. The capability level would describe all of these specifications so that the system administrator could properly design the systems and provide appropriate levels of access to users. Access control lists are often prepared as complex matrices rather than simple lists or tables. The level of detail is important to ensure proper systems design. In general, ACLs enable administrators to restrict access according to user, computer, time, duration, or even access to a particular file on a particular day by a particular user. Access control lists regulate who, what, when, where, and how access is provided to systems. Who is allowed to use the system to include individuals, groups, teams, consultants, regulatory agencies, administrators, etc. What the authorized user can access, programs, applications, files, etc. When authorized users can access the system. For instance, billing takes over the patient file after treatment and discharge, while doctors and nurses and other healthcare personnel have access during treatment and while planning discharge. Where authorized users can access the system from. Can they view healthcare information assets at home? What if they work remotely? What files can they access? Or can they email a file to another person? And finally, how authorized users can access the system. Do they need a password of 6 to 12 characters with at least one letter, one number, and one special character? Or do some systems require biometrics to access information assets, or two-factor authentication? These rules are specified in the access control levels. Here you see a samples Windows ACL. Users are classified as administrators, backup operators, cryptographic operators, etc. While administrators have complete and unrestricted access to the computer domain, which is not recommended except for very few people in the organization, event log readers are only able to view logs from local machines. Network configuration operators, in contrast, have some administrative privileges to manage network configuration, and so on. The names of the professionals will vary from organization to organization, and this is just a sample of what an ACL might look like. Configuration rules are another component of system-specific information security policies. They are instructional codes that guide the execution of the system when information is passing through it. Configuration rule policies are more specific to the operation of a system than access control levels and may or may not deal with users directly. They may deal with more specifically how the systems are configured. Permissions to access may be set up after systems configuration. Many security systems require specific configuration scripts that inform the systems what actions to perform based on the information that they control and/or process. For instance, let's look at firewall configuration rules. Here, Rule 7 says, any traffic coming in on a specified link requesting a telnet session will be accepted but logged. This rule also implies that non-telnet traffic will be denied. This rule is specific to the system, but not necessarily to the level of access. Here's another configuration rule for a firewall. Action specifies whether the packet from source is accepted, allowed through, or dropped. There will be special rules that decide whether data can be sent or received or moved or updated. Finally, the last example is track specifies whether the processing of the specified packet is written to the system log. In healthcare, many of the activities will need to be logged so that users can be tracked to activities. Doctors need to create orders for medication, and that request must be logged for regulatory, inventory, and processing reasons. Some organizations elect to create a single document that combines management guidance and technical specifications into a single set of systems-specific security policies. While sometimes confusing to the users of the policies, it is very practical to have the guidance from both perspectives in a single space. Such a document should carefully articulate the required actions for each procedure described. To summarize, this section covered substantial information on the different types of information security policies, including policies that are relevant to the organization or enterprise as a whole, policies relevant or specific to issues or occurrences, and policies specific to systems. Good information security policies can allow the enterprise to run smoothly, partner with others to accomplish goals, handle access control reliably, and develop rules that can be applied to any issue or system. These rules allow the systems administrators and InfoSec professionals to design the system needed while securing the organizational information assets. We continue with Chapter 4, Information Security Policy. This is Section 3, Guidelines for Implementing Effective Policy. This section will cover the third learning outcome. Explain what is needed to implement effective policy. For policies to be effective, they must be properly developed using industry-accepted practices and formally approved by management. Both of these components must be present. One without the other is insufficient. They must be distributed using all appropriate methods, digitally and print, etc. We know that they must be read by all employees, really read, not like the I agree button that we click on without thinking. Regular security education, training, and assurance programs can help ensure that the policy is read, and once the employees read the policy, then they need to understand them. You don't want them to simply read it, but to understand what they're reading, have it reinforced through CETA programs and integrated into formal methods of reviewing performance. Users must formally agree to policies by act or affirmation. This is where we click I agree, but go back to number 3 and 4. Finally, policies must be uniformly applied and enforced through rewards, penalties, and appropriate re-education as needed. Developing effective InfoSec policy is a time-consuming, strategically important task, particularly in healthcare organizations. If these guidelines are followed, there's greater chance that the policy will be developed and implemented successfully. It is often useful to view policy developed as a 3-part project. In the first part of the project, policy is designed and written, or in the case of an outdated policy, redesigned and rewritten. In the second part, a senior manager or executive at the appropriate level reviews and formally approves the document. In the third part of the development process, management processes are established to perpetuate the policy within the organization. The first step is an exercise in project management, while the latter two require adherence to good business practices. Policy distribution can be accomplished by hard copy distribution or electronic or digital distribution. Unless the organization can prove that the policy actually reached the end users, it cannot be enforced. If they didn't get it, or you can't prove that they received it, then you can't legally enforce it. Distribution of classified policies requires additional levels of controls in the labeling of the document, in the dissemination of new policy, and in the collection and destruction of older versions to assure the confidentiality of the information contained within the policy documents themselves. We will talk about that in more detail later. Not only must you prove that the employees received the policy, but it must be written at a level that is readable. Barriers to employees reading policies can arise from literacy or language issues. If you have a large population of end users who speak a second or third language and or whose native language is not English, then publish in multiple languages. But please make sure you have a good translator. Don't depend on Google Translate. Visually impaired employees require additional assistance either through audio or large type versions of the document, while persons with other disabilities may need different types of accommodations. Do what you have to do to get the policy to the end users in the format that they need. As a healthcare organization, assuming you treat patients, you need to plan to reach patients and end users with multiple types of disabilities and make sure that the policy is accommodating to their needs. Finally, consider readability level. While a college textbook might be written for a greater than 12th grade reading level, it is rare that a policy document would be written for such a high level. To reach your audience, know your audience, who they are and what their abilities are. Again, at a healthcare organization, you may treat people from many walks of life with many different backgrounds. InfoSec professionals need to plan for that. To be certain that the employees understand the policy, the document must be written at a reasonable reading level with minimal technical jargon and management terminology. The next step is to use some form of assessment to gauge how well employees understand the policy's underlying issues. Quizzes and other forms of examination can be employed to assess quantitatively which employees understand the policy by earning a specified minimum score and which employees require additional training and awareness before the policy can be enforced. Users must do some act to indicate that they agree to abide by the policy. For instance, in this class, you take a quiz to indicate that you read and understood the syllabus and agreed to abide by the academic integrity and other course policies in place. Agreement is complete if an employee clicks on I agree or uses an electronic signature in place of a hard copy. Once the person agrees, the affirmation has the effect of contract law and is legally enforcement. What if an employee refuses explicitly to agree to comply with policy? Well, they don't have to sign, but they don't have to work for you either. Here's an example that we've mentioned several times before. It's a licensing agreement for software. Did you read all of the pages prior to clicking I agree? You should have, but I bet you didn't, and I bet you won't next time. How would the reasonable person respond to your failure to read the policy before affirming that you agree? The final component of the design and implementation of effective policies is uniform and impartial enforcement. As in law enforcement, policy enforcement must be able to withstand external scrutiny and pass the reasonable person test. If an employee is punished, censured, or dismissed as a result of a refusal to follow policy and is subsequently able to demonstrate that the policies are not uniformly applied or enforced, the organization may find itself facing punitive as well as compensatory damages and liability. The need for effective policy management has led to the emergence of a class of software tools that support policy development, implementation, and maintenance. Tools like the Vigilant Policy Center, or VPC, keeps policies confidential behind password-protected intranets and generate periodic reports indicating which employees have and have not read and acknowledged to follow the policies. Tools such as VPC also make it clear which manager was responsible for the policy, as his or her name is prominently displayed on the policy along with the date of approval. In summary, this section looked at how to implement appropriate policies. Guidelines included: use industry-accepted practices, distribute in appropriate formats given the user population you have, make sure that end users read and understand the policy you implement. Users must positively affirm that they have read and agree to follow the policy. Finally, be consistent in enforcement of policy with appropriate rewards and penalties, and reinforce regularly through security education, training, and awareness programs. We finish Chapter 4, Information Security Policy, with Section 4 of 4, Policy Development using the SDLC. This section will cover the fourth learning outcome, discuss how to develop, implement, and maintain InfoSec policies. Like any major project, a policy development or redevelopment project should be well planned, properly funded, and aggressively managed to ensure that it is completed on time and within budget. One way to accomplish this goal is by using the Security Systems Development Lifecycle, SDLC. The Security Systems Development Lifecycle follows the same steps as the SDLC for software development. During investigation, the policy development team should obtain support from senior management. They also need support and active involvement of IT management like the CISO or the CIO. The policy development team should clearly articulate goals and properly define project scope. Finally, don't leave out the legal team or any other group affected by the policies. Participation of the correct individuals from the communities of interest affected by the policies, including legal, HR, and accounting, improves user buy-in and the chance of successfully implementing information security policies. During analysis, risks should be assessed by documenting the current InfoSec needs at the organizational level. Then key reference materials should be gathered, including any existing policies. The first task in the design phase is the drafting of the actual policy document. While this task can be done by a committee, it is most commonly done by a single author. Next, the development team or committee reviews the draft InfoSec policy and makes recommendations about its revisions. Once the committee approves the document, it goes to the approving manager or executive for sign-off. In the implementation phase, the team must create a plan to distribute the policies and receive explicit acknowledgement that the users have received, read, and understand the document, compliance. Affirmation may be hard copy, like a signature on a cover page, or digital, like an I agree button pressed. During the maintenance phase, the policy development team monitors, maintains, and modifies the policy as needed to ensure that it remains effective as a tool to meet changing threats. The policy should have a built-in mechanism via which users can report problems, preferably anonymously. Periodic review and maintenance should be built in at regular cycles, like 180 days. As mentioned earlier, while policies can help organizations avoid litigation, their first and foremost function is to inform employees of what is and is not acceptable behavior in the organization. Policy development is not meant to be punitive or roadblock to your employees or onerous for them to overcome. Rather, it's meant to improve employee productivity and prevent potentially embarrassing situations. In reality, most employees inherently want to do what is right. If properly informed and educated on what is acceptable and what is not, they will usually choose to follow the rules for acceptable behavior. InfoSec is meant to make it easier for them to safely access what they need, when they need it, in the format they need, and in the time period they need it. InfoSec is preventative and prescriptive. It's not meant to be a way to catch people doing something wrong. In summary, to improve the chances of development of a successful information security policy, use a structured project method, such as the systems development lifecycle. Maintenance of an InfoSec policy should be completed regularly during scheduled review cycles and unscheduled when the need arises. Policies should generally be reviewed each year at a minimum. If you give the InfoSec policies to workers in a clear and understandable manner, they will likely try to do the right thing. If they don't, they're not the employees you want anyway.